Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and this lecture is about love. Not just love the way everyone usually thinks of it, but good love versus bad love. Dr. Judy Ecoff wrote an article called Fusion and Merger in Intimate Relationships. And she wrote it because she recognized that we and our culture simply don't have adequate language to discuss the complete continuum of romantic and other relationships. She noticed, and I've noticed in my practice and life, and I bet you all have too, that people use the word love in so many different contexts. And it seems to mean different things to different people at different times. So this article, which I think is one of the most profound I've ever read, is about the ability to distinguish healthy, mature, real love, which she calls merger, from pathological joining, from bad love, from the love that way too many of us maybe have experienced in our past, love that blew up, love that ended dramatically or disastrously, love that just seemed to fade away, and when it was over we thought, what happened? How did this happen? Dr. Ecoff's article and the details of it allow us to think about a template for analyzing where are we on this continuum, and that's one of her first big ideas that makes a great deal of sense after we look into it for a few minutes, that love is not a single thing. It isn't a point on a chart. It really is a nature, the nature of relating in a more or less healthy way. And I think this material will allow all of you to take a good close look inside and a good close look into your history of relationships and get a fairly, if you can, a fairly honest evaluation of what went wrong, why, and of course the goal is to move toward relationships that are healthier, endure longer, are more rewarding, are the source of great joy instead of great sadness. And I think she's right about another thing, that we are, as Freud said, object-seeking beings. We are pleasure-seeking beings as well, which is what Freud thought earliest in his theorizing about the human mind. Initially, I think, he thought we just have the desire to get more and more pleasure and avoid pain. Pretty simple, almost evolutionary way of thinking. Subsequently, he became more sophisticated, and those after him became much more sophisticated and recognized that maybe also going back and looking at evolution in our tribal environment for most of human experience on this planet, we're not creatures that survive in isolation. We're tribal, we're communal. We desperately need companionship of one kind or another. We desperately need family relationships to survive at all. I mean, the worst punishment traditional societies could meet against one of their members was banishment. Even today, solitary confinement is punishment. We are creatures who often desperately need connection with each other to survive at any level of health. And so we keep trying. And Dr. Ecoff's article is about how to try more effectively, about how we can become healthier, more whole, and relate to others who are also in that way so that we can move toward a healthier, richer relational dynamic. Now, she wants to be clear about this, that this really is a style of relating. This is about sort of a characterological style. It's not a label of pathology. She doesn't want fusion and merger to become sort of dichotomous. She recognizes that there's a continuum, and that on a bad day, we can all get a little primitive. On a bad day, we can all get a little crazy. And we struggle on a daily basis to continue to integrate and become better human beings. And she recognizes, and I think rightly, that the only way we can do that is in a relationship. Nobody can read Freud or anybody that's come after Freud in a book by themselves and improve their character. It's not about that kind of intellectual development. What she's describing is the need we have for each other in ways that allow us to mature emotionally. It's really the core of a therapeutic relationship. It ought to be the core, can be the core of a healthy, loving relationship, that both parties are there to help each other get better, get stronger, And if it's not on that end of the spectrum, if it's down on the fusion end of the spectrum, remember she calls what I will call good love as merger and bad love as fusion. And if it's down on that end, we're talking about two people who very rarely have an established, well-developed sense of their own identity. And they glom on to each other as a substitute for that identity. That really the relationship ends up substituting for a solid, stable self. One of the reasons those kind of relationships are often volatile, because a threat to the relationship then is felt by the parties as a threat to your very identity. And that results in often a great deal of violence and very aggressive behavior. Fusion and relationships are volatile, sometimes dangerous, most of the time unpleasant and always drenched in anxiety. We're going to get to the details of both fusion and merger in a little bit. I want to just establish some background. It's almost humorous to ask the question, what is love? Psychology has never been very good at describing health. We're pretty good at describing pathology. We know mental illness when we see it. We know how to help people who are diagnosed as mentally ill. But no field in psychology has ever done a very good job of describing what mental health is. And I think that's one of the great advantages of Dr. Ekoff's paper, is that it's one of the first efforts I've read in a very long time to describe what healthy love means. The poets have been working on love for thousands of years, and it just seems like it's taken the psychologists quite a while to catch up. And I think this is a profound addition to the poetic history of discussions of love. Now, I think before we get into the details, it's essential that you understand a little bit about child development. The assumption in Dr. Ekoff's paper is that the primary importance of development from birth to 3 or 4 or 5 years, and frankly, there's some good research recently that even in utero is where development really begins, and that the experience of the fetus in the womb has a profound developmental impact before it's even born. I think there's a growing consensus that that's true. One way or the other, no one in my field doubts for a minute now that the human personality, the human character, our sense of self, our identity, whatever you want to call it, is laid down between birth and 3 or 4 or 5 years. The fundamentals of your character, the fundamentals of your coherence, integration, wholeness, health, and if that didn't happen, if the development didn't proceed appropriately, if your needs weren't met at any of the several developmental levels, then development gets derailed. The sense of self ends up symptomatic. Now, I'm not going to repeat the several lectures already in the archive concerning the details of child development, but it's essential that before this article proceeds, or this lecture proceeds, that the viewer ground themselves in child development, because it's the only way it's going to make sense. I like to think of fusion and merger as a linear continuum. On my left, we have fusion. On the right, we have merger. And one of Dr. Ekoff's great insights is that two people never get together, never form a relationship, unless they are very close on the continuum. This is central. You need to grasp this. Because what happens is people come into my office all the time. As a clinician, I see couples and I see individuals, and they frequently will say, among other things, Doc or Donovan, can you help me fix my partner? I'm actually in pretty good shape. My partner's the one that's really troubled. And my answer is, if they're that troubled, why are you with them? You may have a different level of trouble in terms of the style, but people do not get together and establish even medium-term relationships where they are not substantially equal in psychic structure. The style of their illness may be different. You might get a masochist that tends to hook up with a narcissist, but their psychic structures are always going to be about the same. And on the continuum from bad love to good love, fusion to merger, you're going to find they're almost always right next to each other, wherever they are on the continuum. Someone in the middle, mostly have good days, some days are bad. You're going to find them in a relationship with someone almost the same. very little variation between each other. That frustrates people. That causes anxiety because almost everyone can see the faults in our partners so much easier than they can see the faults in ourselves. And one of Dr. Ecoff's advantages in this paper is that it puts the problem squarely in your own personal lap. If you've got a relationship and there are problems, step one is to fix yourself. Step one is to recognize how you are contributing to the dynamic that's causing you stress and trouble and the relationship to be in difficulty. There is no way around that. And I think one of her great insights is this, that you can't change your partner. You can't make them do something they don't want to do. You can't force them to be someone they're not or to grow beyond their defense mechanisms or their psychic structure. We have, and this is in some ways a bit tragic and perhaps unfortunate, but it's human nature and there's no way around it. We have only one way to influence any partner we're in a meaningful relationship with, and that is to inspire them with our shining example. In any relationship where there's a problem, if the partner feels like there's a problem, the first effort is to look inside, look back into your own development, look on this continuum of fusion to merger and decide where you are and how you got there. And if you think your partner is somewhere, you need to recognize that you're probably standing right next to him or her on that continuum for the same reasons or similar reasons that he or she is. It is humbling, and sometimes we're in denial about our own issues. Okay, we're always in denial about our own issues. It's so much easier to see other people's problems than ourselves, again. My hope is that this article will give many of you hope and will give many of you perhaps the motivation to take that good look. And the other thing that she says is that, again, we can't do it alone. You can use a relationship to foster your own growth. In fact, that's the only way to foster your own growth, is within a relationship of some kind. An intimate relationship, a romantic relationship, a partnership. I think family relationships remain open to the possibility of growth. Siblings, even parents and children can still move together if they have a great deal of courage and openness, okay? And Dr. Ecoff's article is not just about romantic relationships. She's very clear about this. This is, in some ways, how we all relate to each other regardless of the nature of the relationships. This is how humans relate. Wherever we are in the continuum, wherever our developmental trajectory has left us, that is going to be, it is at that point on the continuum between bad love and good love that we get the characteristics that define our relationships. And so whether it's a coworker, a boss, an underling, a subordinate, a teacher, a student, friendships, all human relationships can be understood, or at least can be helpfully understood, if not totally understood, using the ideas that Dr. Ecoff has laid down in this wonderful article. She does focus primarily on intimate love relationships, long-term partnerships, because the dynamics seem the most obvious. But she is also very clear that this is above and beyond just romantic relationships. And matter of fact, it might be easier to think in these terms about relationships that aren't quite so intimate, because simple truth is, intimate relationships, closely examined, always evoke a little anxiety in us. So maybe a little less intense human connection relationship might be more amenable initially to evaluation along these terms. You practice at a relationship, at understanding a relationship that's not quite so important, and get a little better at recognizing your participation in the problems that relatively vanilla relationship might be experiencing. Try that, and it may be a little bit easier when you get down to the core relationships that really are central to your life. So one of the criteria that she uses that is central in determining where you are, when you're together literally, physically, as well as sort of emotionally and mentally, do you maintain your sense of identity? Can you join with another without losing your identity, without being immersed in the other person's existence? I have several patients who have shown a tendency to, once they get into a relationship, they fall into it. And they seem to cut off their previous social circle. The other person becomes the central function in their life. They exclude previous friends. They may narrow their career path to be with this person. And what you see, and it has a feel of almost obsessive compulsiveness about it. And you end up with behaviors like stalking, like rifling through pants pockets, like checking emails, like constant phone calls and things like that. And you see that the person, their own identity through behaviors like that is shown to be dependent on the nature of the connection with that other person. And that's a dangerous position to be in. If you're with someone and you do not lose your own identity, in fact, your identity is fostered, enhanced, opportunities for growth present themselves in this mutual back and forth of good love, then that's a strong sign that you're on the right side of the spectrum and that your relationship dynamic is healthy. When you're together, you maintain your sense of identity. Now, what happens when you part? If you part, do you have a sense that you're falling apart? Do you have a sense, do you feel fear? Do you feel anxiety? Do you have a sense that the world is a bit of a dangerous place and you need contact with another person to maintain a sense of integrity and wholeness? If you part without trauma, if you join without loss of self, then you're on the right side of the spectrum. Then you're experiencing more, at least, of the merger idea, good love, healthy love. If that isn't the case, if the opposite is the case, if you do have that experience that the two of you are glomming onto each other and that the relationship is functioning as a substitute for your own identity, and that being apart is the source of tremendous anxiety, and that even when you're together, there's this overwhelming sense of oneness and loss of identity, then something needs to happen to back out of that safely and figure out how your identity can be firmed up. Now, here's the good news. No matter where you are in the continuum, if both parties realize that they're not in a perfect relationship, if both parties realize that they've got some movement, if both parties listen to this lecture, for example, it may very well be likely, or at least possible, that they can move together on the continuum. That in the relationship, Dr. Ekoff suggests, movement and love and growth is possible. Only in relationship, whether it's therapeutic or intimate or whatever, we develop in relationship. And Dr. Ekoff understands this because she understands child development. Back to that for a minute. Can a baby exist by itself? And the answer is of course not. In fact, one of the great pediatricians and psychoanalysts of the 20th century, D.W. Winnicott, actually began a lecture one time he was a child development specialist. He was a pediatrician for 20 years before he became a psychoanalyst and one of the most respected in the world. He came out to give a speech to 200 or 300 psychoanalysts, and he began the speech by saying, "There's no such thing as a baby," and stopped. And everyone was murmuring, what does he mean? What does he mean? And then he smiled and said, "There's only a baby and a mother together." And he's right. We can't imagine a baby by itself. A baby by itself could not survive. So from the beginning, growth, health, is tied to a human connection. Dr. Ekoff simply takes the position that nothing fundamental changes, that to be a healthy baby, to be a healthy toddler, to be a healthy young child, it takes the loving connection of a family dynamic that focuses on the child's needs. As adults, if we are going to continue growing, we need another kind of relationship to meet those continuing needs and allow us to grow and become healthier. There is no end point to growth. There is no end point to health. You can always get crazier, and you can always get healthier and stronger. And I think that's a process-oriented idea. There is no goal that ends, okay, I'm fine now, everything's fine, I'm healthy, I've made it. Whew, glad that's over. No point like that in human existence. we always have the potential for more integration, more wholeness, more growth, and more love. And I don't know, I think I've said this in one of the other lectures, I don't know if there's some existential point to life. I'm not sure about religious beliefs, but I do know that there's one thing that I'm shooting for in life that makes sense to me, and that's at the end of my life, can I answer this question? Yes. Have I experienced as much true love as I can in my life? And if I can answer that question, yes, you know what? That's not a bad life. All the big metaphysical questions, I got to pass on. That's just not my area. But I think Dr. Ekoff opens up the possibility for us to think in those terms. Growth, movement, process, the possibility of growth throughout the adult years. We need never stop growing and changing and maturing until the day we die. Okay, you can have the day you die off. You can stop growing on that day. But until then, she opens up the possibility that the presence of a loving relationship at whatever level can be the source of tremendous growth, and I think also tremendous joy in a way that abides, in a way that makes life meaningful. I don't know anyone who's happy alone, really happy. I know lots of people who are schizoid, who are depressed, who spend a lot of time by themselves. But I don't think any of them feel a great deal of profound existential joy. Again, Dr. Ekoff talks about solitude. And I drew a couple diagrams that may make some sense. They look like this. In merger, there's two circles that overlap each other. Not perfectly. They're not separate, they overlap. That's the middle area. On the inside of the circles that don't overlap, that part that doesn't overlap, we can call that solitude. You're not with the person right then, but you're in a larger relationship. There's a circle around the two circles. And so that when you're alone, you still have a sense of being contained within the larger relationship. That opens up the possibility of an experience I call solitude. And that the word in the English language feels good, solitude. It feels restful, it feels peaceful, it feels regenerating in some way. You take a good book, you go out to Discovery Park on a summer day, you sit under a tree, you bring a lunch, and you're there by yourself, and you feel this immense sense of peace and solitude. Why? Because your wife or husband or partner is at home waiting for you to come back. And so you don't feel this sort of existential loneliness that's quite distressing, quite evocative of very primitive anxiety. If you don't have solitude because you're alone in the context of a relationship, you may experience isolation. Now that feels terrible. If you're truly alone, if there isn't a containing relationship, then that's frequently what I see in my practice drives people to desperation. In some ways, I think that's a good explanation for a great deal of addictive behavior. Sexual addictions, drug addictions, alcohol addictions, food addictions. We don't feel comfortable in isolation, so we reach out to fill ourselves with other things. You can put gambling addiction, internet addiction, porn addiction. These are all attempts to fill an empty space that perhaps better should be filled with a loving relationship. Why a person goes down that road as opposed to another, that's the subject of child development. On that point, again, without re-lecturing on the child development material, her basic premise is that we grow into individuals in the maternal matrix of love and care. We internalize, we accumulate the experiences of love and care in the arms of our parents and slowly build up an identity over time based on getting enough love. Now, no childhood is perfect. There's always frustration. There's always anger and fear and anxiety. That's true in every child's life to some degree. The idea of emotional health is there enough love taken in? Is there enough support and care, enough identification with the strong, loving objects of childhood, the parental figures, is there enough of that to build up a healthy sense of self? And if so, you have the possibility of reaching out from that healthy self to find another healthy self to be in love with. If that has not happened, if you remain unintegrated, if you remain fragmented, if your development has been derailed by insufficient parental love and care, then the particular type of problem that develops will depend on exactly how that happens. We have, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, we have hundreds now of different types of mental illness that have different symptom packages, and we label these different symptoms different things, but they all go down. I think we can fairly say now that virtually everything we call a mental illness today can find its source, its etiology, its cause, in some derailment of childhood development. So what Dr. Ekoff is suggesting, that if you're going to be in love, good love, real love as an adult, you're going to have to either been one of those lucky people who had good enough parents that got you through your development into a healthy, whole sense of self, or you're going to have to recognize that you did not get what you need and figure out a way to restart the developmental process, continue the structuralization of your identity, your mind, yourself, however you think about it, and only then will you be in a healthy relationship. And one of the things you may have experienced is this misunderstanding that you fell in love once, and it was so passionate, it was so intense, it was such love, but then it ended badly. Someone betrayed someone, it fell apart, the feeling went away, and so you try again. You try to recover from the loss, and you try again. And guess what? Same darn thing happens. And then guess what? If this hasn't happened to you, you certainly know someone that it's happened to. You see people repeating a pattern, multiple relationships ending badly, and it causes frustrations to some of your friends sometimes. If you see a person and they get into a relationship and you're sort of worried about it to begin with because you can see it's not exactly good, and it breaks up, and your friend does a little bit of work and finds someone else. And what do you see right off the bat? That they're exactly the same as the other person. And guess what's going to happen? Almost exactly the same thing. Freud called it a repetition compulsion. He saw people doing the same darn thing over and over again and assumed there was something almost biological about it. We now think there's something psychological about it, that we repeat the patterns of our childhood until we recognize and get the help we need to do something different. So if you've got a repetitive pattern of relationships that haven't worked very well, there is no better explanation than Dr. Ekoff's idea that developmentally you need help, and what you're feeling isn't love. It's fusion, it's bad love, and our frustration as a field is that we don't have good language to explain what's going on. I used to be a criminal defense attorney and a prosecutor, and I interviewed dozens of domestic violence perpetrators and victims. And it was a constant source of frustration to me at the time. I didn't really understand it. A domestic violence victim, whether it's a male or female, it's about even these days it seems, and I would ask them, well, why do you go back to this person? I mean, they beat you bloody, you went to the hospital, look at you, you're a mess. Why are you going back to them? Why have you gone back to them before when the same thing kept happening? And the answer I heard all the time was, because I love her, because I love him. And I thought, well, no, you don't. That can't be love. And then I would ask the perpetrator, why do you treat him so bad? Why do you treat her so mean? Why do you hit him? Why do you hurt him that way? I just love her so much, she frustrates me. I just love her so much, I can't take it. And I thought, no, you don't. No, you don't. And it wasn't until Dr. Ekoff's article that I finally figured out what was really going on. It wasn't love at all. It was fusion. It was the substitute of a relationship for a sense of identity. And when that identity was threatened, because the relationship was threatened, then violence becomes psychically justified. Because what's the threat? the threat is almost self-annihilation. And if you feel like you're about to be annihilated, you can justify almost any behavior to stop that terrible experience from happening. I've used the most extreme case that comes to mind, and that's the O.J. Simpson situation. Now, I know he got acquitted of the murder, but let's just assume for the sake of argument he was guilty as sin, like most people understand that he really was. What justified his behavior? How do you make sense of it? He's a rich, powerful guy. But he was also, in some ways, an unformed human being. And what happened, I think, if I may speculate here a little bit, is that he saw his wife cheating. He caught her cheating. And his identity was tied to the relationship. His identity had been tied to his life as an athlete. It was always tied to something external. And he never was himself a very whole or healthy person. And when he came upon proof that his relationship was threatened, he butchered those two people. And it makes no sense. It was a wanton act of extreme cruelty. It was a butchery. It was savage in its violence. He didn't just kill them, he butchered them. And that is only explicable in the context of a psychological, mostly unconscious experience of such fear and such rage that can only be explained by his reaction unconsciously, developmentally, to the behavior that she had, which represented a threat to his identity, which justified the level of violence, because at least psychically, it was warranted given the threat to his identity. Now that's maybe a bad example, and maybe it's a too extreme example, but I think sometimes extreme examples clarify the question for us. Haven't we all gotten mad and lost our temper at some point? Why do you lose your temper? In the moment when you lose your temper, with your partner especially, you are absolutely justified, you feel, in saying all those bad, hurtful things you say. In the moment, you don't have any doubt that he or she deserves everything you're saying and then some. You wake up the next morning and you feel, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I overreacted, I apologize. But how do you explain that in the moment you felt totally justified? You didn't have any doubt that they were exactly the terrible things you were calling them. I think that's the connection, that if you are down on the fusion side of the scale, then a conflict in your relationship threatens your identity, and you're losing your temper, overreacting, getting aggressive, not to O.J. Simpson's level, of course, but that dynamic is explicable as the result of a threat to your inner sense of self. I haven't found a better explanation for it yet. It certainly isn't love in the normal, healthy sense of the word. Okay, so to reiterate a little bit. None of us is perfect. We're all somewhere probably in the middle of the spectrum. On a bad day, we can fragment and get a little worse. On a good day, with a good partner, we can move toward more healthy relating, more real love, more empathy. And I'm going to walk through the details. I'm going to walk through effectively a checklist of all the things that would indicate a fusion relationship and all the things that would indicate a merger relationship. Good love, merger; bad love, fusion. A couple of cultural examples first. There's a country music, the blues, some rap music. If you listen to what's going on in the song, what you hear is almost always fusion. I'm not a big music fan in any of those three genres, but I remember a long time ago seeing a video of a country singer. I think her name was Carrie Underwood, and she was in the video. Her boyfriend had cheated on her, and she was destroying his Jeep. She was knifing his tires, cutting the upholstery, bashing his headlights in with a baseball bat. She was just insane, it seemed to me. But it was being presented as if she was in love, and it was all justified because he had betrayed her. And I thought, that's a perfect example of fusion. And in our culture, that's an example of the confusion between good love and bad love. People watching that video had a sense, well, probably more of the women than of the men, I think, probably had a sense of, well, yeah, he deserved that. And of course the answer is nobody deserves to have physical violence perpetrated against them or their property. That's a sign of mental illness. That's a sign of weakness. That's a sign of more anxiety than you can tolerate. That's a sign of a fragile sense of identity. There is no excuse for domestic violence, and that's what that video was about. Explanations for it seem to come on the fusion side of this. No healthy person would do that, it seems to me. Okay. I think I said already that we have to keep in mind that this is a process, that we're not in some stasis, that we're not in some particular point on the continuum, and that's where we're stuck and we got to live with it. No, we're flexible creatures, we're adaptive, we can change, we can grow. Dr. Ekoff is, I don't want to say naively optimistic, but she seems to have a very positive view on the potential for human growth and change. I can't argue with that too much at all. She also suggests that primitive states that are within all of us, bad experiences that we've had in childhood, things that remain within us. Our identity is the accumulation of all of our experiences, good or bad, and we frequently have pockets of primitive dynamics that remain very alive in us. Under stress and pressure, we can act those primitive parts out in relationship. This is part of her optimism, I think, that kind of dynamic, which often in the moment is hideously painful, ought to, after the fact, be a source of curiosity. What the hell happened? Why did I do that? Why did you say those things? Can we please try to understand what happened in a way that will allow us to move beyond that happening again? If you find yourself in a repetitive pattern, and most of us do at some point, this article, I hope, will be the impetus to go, wait a minute, time out. We have to do something differently. This is not working. So the joke is, how's that repetition working for you? Not very well, I assume, in most cases. Second thing, or third or fourth or fifth thing by now. None of this is conscious, folks. This is the part that most people have a hard time understanding. Everything I'm talking about now is completely unconscious. Nobody consciously says, yes, I can see I'm in a bad relationship and I don't have a very good sense of myself, so I'm going to slap my partner around a little bit. That's not how it works. The profound insight that Freud had of the amazing power of the unconscious remains, I think, as true, if not truer today than it was when he discovered it in the early 1900s. That our goal here is to understand behavior, not judge the morality of it. And the only way to understand it is to recognize how all of this, virtually, is unconscious and developmental and part of your character that you're simply not aware of but should become aware of and therefore have some control over. The repetitive patterns are an indication of the power of the unconscious. The only way to overcome that is to bring those unconscious dynamics to conscious awareness through therapy or a good relationship of some kind, and it is only then that you have the power to do something different, to see why you're doing what you're doing, and to take steps to change behavior that really has no chance of being successful because it is a repetition of unsuccessful childhood experiences, and repeating bad experiences never helps very much. Okay. Three mental mechanisms that I think would help understand how this works practically or pragmatically. Splitting and projective identification. Two concepts from previous lectures that are central to understand mature love or bad love. Every baby splits, puts all good over here, all bad over here. That's a mature thing for a baby to do. It works for them. There's not a sophisticated, complex understanding of mother. There's the good mother, and Melanie Klein, one of Freud's great co-workers and developers, called it the breast, actually, the good breast and the bad breast. It's a little confusing when you start talking about body parts, but what she mainly meant was the experience the baby took in from its mother. The idea that we experience things in a primitive way only as good or bad. We want the good, we want to make the bad go away. And that projective part is the making the bad go away very frequently. Sometimes if we feel bad in ourselves, we send the good part into our partner. Let them protect it and keep it safe. That's why we sort of glom onto each other a little bit. So there's some mental mechanisms here that I'm not going to go into detail now, but are central and lodged, I think, with good explanations in the child development material. But you're going to have to keep in mind that those primitive, unconscious defense mechanisms or mental mechanisms of splitting and projection, because they're central to understand how we can contain ourselves, how we can relate to others with love and empathy and a meaningful understanding of each other, as opposed to seeing in the other all the bad things about ourselves, taking from the other what's good and giving them the bad and accusing them of what really we feel guilty of through these unconscious projective processes. More on that later. All right, let's talk about a few of the details that might suggest functioning on one level or the other. Communication. Everybody wants to communicate better. I frequently get couples in my clinical office who come and the first thing they say is, we're not communicating very well. And they want me to help them communicate. And it's usually obvious in 30 seconds that they don't have a problem with the English language and making themselves understood. If they can afford therapy, if they can make it to the office on time, if they're gainfully employed and moderately well educated, they can speak the English language well enough. That's communication, the way they think about it, is never the actual problem. A couple of examples. Again, and now we go back to recognizing that what they're talking about isn't the problem. Their communication isn't the problem. It's not the thing. It's the meaning of the thing. It's the unconscious meaning of their communication that is often causing the emotional difficulty between them. So frequently we have a complaint of one party by the other. And it often doesn't actually equate to the real problem. I think I've seen more than one example of this. The woman tells the man that she doesn't like this, that this has got to stop. Or he needs to fix this. So he fixes it. And nothing changes. And he's frustrated and angry because he's done what he's told and she's still on him. What happens is that the thing they're talking about isn't what she's really talking about. And that it's something else that he's not doing, some emotional connection that he's failing to recognize. And it's that failure to communicate. When someone is speaking English and the other one understands it, but what they really mean is that they're not getting their emotional needs met. And this person takes the literal words as fact and reacts to them. The speaker remains just frustrated. And then the other person who tries to comply is resentful for not getting credit for doing what he was told to do, and off we go to the races. I mean, this is so painfully common, it's almost comical. Perhaps a more, if that's what's going on, we've got a small indicator that there are unconscious dynamics that are keeping the relationship too close to the fusion side of the continuum. Another communication problem. You hear someone say, I'm going to find out what really happened. I'm going to get to the truth. When you hear that kind of anger, that kind of rage, hatred almost, does the person care about truth at that point? Do they care what really happened? They've already made their mind up. They're furious, they're enraged, and they're going to find the evidence that justifies their rage, no matter what the truth is. And Dr. Eekhoff uses this beautiful, almost poetic phrase. The search for truth is infused with hate. And at that point, you're not communicating and nobody cares what the truth is. Nobody cares what reality is. People are operating at an unconscious emotional level and justifying possibly quite bad actions based on that emotional experience, the feelings that are not facts, but are not understood not to be facts. If I'm enraged, you must have done something really terrible. Turns out that's not true. Unconsciously, you might have had what Freud called a transference reaction, a childhood experience of rage and anger that's evoked in you, evoked into your conscious experience by something the other person did that reminded you of that. Unconsciously, you're not aware of it. But because you're not aware of its unconscious source in your childhood, you feel intensely. And the only thing that makes sense is that person must have done something terrible to me to justify this feeling. The feelings are facts. And off you go to the races, and the ashtray gets thrown across the room, and screaming and yelling happens, and none of it has anything to do with truth or reality. When the search for truth is suffused with hate, the relationship is in grave danger, and frankly, sometimes people's physical integrity is in grave danger. Some people do the opposite. They have a lack of communication. You all know someone who speaks in euphemisms, who speaks in jargon, slang. You know what I'm saying? When I hear that, I want to say, no, actually, I don't know what you're saying. Tell me what you're saying. A small example, you know. Well, no, I don't know. Tell me what you're saying. Help me understand. There's a vagueness about their language, a lack of clarity. They never quite get to the point. It's all sort of fuzzy. They can talk a lot. They can be there talking for 15, 20 minutes, and at the end you go, what was that about? What did they say? I don't remember what they were talking about. Vagueness can be a defense, because if you clarify what you mean, if you are really clear about what you need and want, if you are really clear about how it is you are frustrated with what the other person is doing, you're generating conflict. And if conflict threatens the relationship, and the relationship is substituting for a self or for your identity, then that can't be allowed. So you get people in fusion-style relationships, their communication styles are often not very communicative at all. If clarity is a threat to the relationship, it's amazing how much we can abuse the English language. Misuse of language, a variation of this theme. You can talk a lot and not say anything, similar to sort of being so vague. Vagueness, wordiness, both, they cover up threatening differences. So I think communication style is one of the first indications. If you can look at your partner in the eye, speak from the heart, and actually mean what you say, and actually recognize what's going on inside you, and to be able to communicate that. And if your partner does that to and with you, and you can empathically sort of intuitively understand what they're saying, and you get it, and you acknowledge it, and you can put it in terms that make sense to them, and you go back and forth, you're communicating. You're in love. You're on the merger side of the scale. Yay for you. Almost, there's darn few problems that can't be solved if you're in that place. Someone asks me all the time, are there differences between men and women on this question? Let me think. The answer is yes, of course. There are gender differences in communication style. There are gender differences in priorities and mating priorities. The evolutionary psychologists have been so clear about this that's no longer really disputed. Even the cognitive behaviorist research scientists have acknowledged very clear gender differences in a variety of contexts. And I'm sorry if it offends folks who want the genders to be perfectly equal across the board. Science has, I think, established that there are differences between men and women, that we just have to deal with it. One of those differences is in the way we relate to each other, and it seems clear that from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, men and women have some degree of difference in the nature of their ability to be in a committed relationship. Now, I think the differences remain relatively small. Men, the evidence is clear and unequivocal. Men live longer, are happier, and are healthier if they're in committed monogamous relationships. Committed monogamous relationships for men are the best way to win the genetic struggle for survival. A committed monogamous relationship for a man gives them more certain paternity, gives them better protection of their children, gives them a presence that allows them to assist their children in the raising of the grandchildren, which is the goal of evolutionary psychology, to continue the genetic line. So I think the gender differences can be made too much of, that by and large, though stylistically they're different, at some level, men and women both function best in loving relationships. So I think both those things are true. Yes, there are some differences, but fundamentally, men and women must be in a loving relationship of some kind to be happy and healthy and to live long, joyous, meaningful lives. Combining now love, relationships, and development, we choose a partner who will reinforce our own self-image. We choose a partner who is inevitably, again, structurally similar to us on the continuum. That means, what that means in terms of development is that we tend to choose a partner who reflects our internal object relations, who reflects our experience of a loving mother and father, or perhaps a not so loving mother and father. That we inevitably look toward an object, we respond, we gravitate toward men and women in romantic relationships beginning in adolescence and through adulthood that reflect the pattern laid down in our own developmental childhoods, for better or worse.